Ivy Coleridge was 19 years old, and by every official measure, she was homeless. No family left to claim her. No plan beyond the next sunrise. Just a small tin locket her mother had left behind, and the $92 her uncle had shoved into her hand like he was paying off a debt. And with that $92, Ivy bought something nobody else wanted, a dead man's claim to a stretch of desert where, 40 years earlier, an entire supply convoy had vanished without a trace. 6 wagons, 12 men, enough goods to found a town. They rode out into the flats one morning and simply never arrived anywhere again. The land office clerk barely looked up when she paid. Folks had searched for that convoy for decades, he told her. Sun, sand, and time had swallowed it whole. Ivy Coleridge was wasting her last dollars on a ghost story. But what nobody in that office knew, what her own family never bothered to ask, was that Ivy wasn't chasing a legend. She had a reason to believe the convoy hadn't vanished by accident at all, and she was about to become the first person in 40 years to find out where it really went. Settle in for this one, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Before we get into Ivy's story tonight, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like hers, and we read every single one. Ivy Coleridge was born into a family that measured its worth in wagon ruts and river crossings, the daughter of a man named Haulin Coleridge, a freight master who had spent 30 years charting the safest routes across the territory for merchants too afraid to trust the desert alone. Haulin was not a wealthy man, but he was a respected one, the kind of man other freighters sought out before a long haul, because he understood something most men didn't, that the desert never forgot anything. Every dry wash, every collapsed ridge, every stretch of sand that swallowed wagon wheels whole, held a memory if you knew how to read it. He taught Ivy to read those memories before she was old enough to understand what she was learning. She could identify a game trail from a cattle trail by the time she was 7. She could tell how many days old a set of wagon tracks were by the way the wind had worked at their edges. And she carried, always, a small tin locket her mother had given her before she died, its surface scratched and dull, holding nothing inside but a tiny curl of pressed desert flour that her mother had once called a promise pressed into metal. Ivy never quite understood what that promise meant. Not yet. When Ivy was 11, a flash flood tore through the canyon where her father was scouting a new route, and he never came home. Her mother had been gone 2 years already by then, taken by a lung sickness that crept in slow and left quietly. With both parents gone, Ivy was sent to live with her father's brother, a merchant named Ivy Coleridge, who ran a modest supply store in a dusty crossroads town, and who saw his niece the way he saw an unsold crate of goods, something to be stored, managed, and eventually moved along. Ezra was not a cruel man in the way that leaves bruises. He was cruel in the way that never raises its voice. The kind of cruelty that shows up in ledgers and locked doors and meals counted out to the exact portion that duty required and not one bite more. Ivy worked in his store from sunrise, stocking shelves, hauling water, keeping his books balanced with a precision that even Ezra grudgingly admitted was better than his own. She slept in a narrow room behind the storeroom that smelled permanently of dried beans and lamp oil, and for 8 years that room was the only home she had. The only person in that town who ever looked at Ivy like she was more than free labor was an old freighter named Cassius, a friend of her father's who still came through twice a year hauling goods on the southern route. Cassius remembered Haulin Coleridge fondly, and in the evenings when he passed through, he would sit with Ivy on the store's back steps and tell her stories, real ones, the kind freighters only shared with people they trusted. And there was one story he told more than once, always in a lower voice, always glancing over his shoulder first. 40 years before Ivy was born, a supply convoy had left the eastern depot bound for a mining settlement deep in the flats. 6 wagons, 12 men, enough tools and provisions to build a town from nothing. They were never seen again. No wreckage, no bodies, no trail. The desert had simply closed over them like water over a dropped stone. And every search party that went looking in the years after came back with nothing but sunburn and silence. Cassius always ended the story the same way, tapping the side of his head. "Your father spent years chasing that convoy on paper," he told her once. "Said the maps didn't add up. Said somebody wanted it lost." The end of Ivy's life in that back room came without warning, the way these things so often do. On a hot morning in early autumn, Ezra called her into the front of the store, where he stood behind the counter going through papers with the same flat efficiency he used for restocking orders. He told her, without preamble, that he had sold the business to a rival merchant from 2 towns over, effective the following week. The sale included the building, which meant it included her room. He said this the way a man announces the weather, as though he were simply reporting a fact of nature rather than upending the only stability she had left. He reached beneath the counter and set down a small cloth pouch, explaining that it held $92, calculated with the same careful arithmetic he applied to every transaction in his ledgers. A portion owed from her father's final wages, a portion he considered fair severance for 8 years of labor, and not a cent more. He did not ask what she would do. He did not wish her well. He simply slid the pouch across the counter and returned to his papers. The conversation and Ivy's place in his life closed for good. Ivy did not argue. She had learned long ago that arguing with Ezra was like arguing with a locked door. The effort changed nothing and only cost her dignity in the process. She walked back to the narrow room behind the storeroom and packed the little that was truly hers: a spare dress, a sturdy knife, a coil of rope, a half-used bar of soap, and the tin locket, which she tied on a leather cord and hung around her neck where it had rested since she was a child. She did not pack anything of Ezra's, not even the blanket he had grudgingly given her one hard winter, because she wanted to leave that room owing him nothing at all. When she walked out of the store the next morning, the bell above the door rang once behind her, sharp and final, and she did not turn around to look at it. She walked into town with the $92 folded carefully in her pocket, past the general store and the saloon and the church, straight to the small government land office at the edge of town, a place that smelled of old paper and pipe smoke. She had spent the walk turning Cassius's words over in her mind again and again until they had stopped feeling like an old man's fireside tale and started feeling like something else entirely. A thread her father had been pulling on for years before the flood took him. A thread nobody had ever finished pulling. The clerk at the counter, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, listened to her request with visible amusement, telling her that the old Convoy claim was still on the books simply because nobody in their right mind had ever wanted it, that the land was cursed as far as most folks were concerned, worthless sand with a worthless story attached to it. Ivy set her money on the counter without a word, and as the clerk began stamping the deed, dismissing her with the same tired warning everyone in that town seemed to know by heart, Ivy felt something settle deep in her chest that she hadn't felt in 8 long years behind that store counter. Not grief, not fear, but the unmistakable, quiet certainty that she was finally walking toward the one thing her father had never gotten the chance to find. The deed sat folded in Ivy's pocket as she left the land office, but it was the map the clerk had reluctantly sold her for $2 extra that she couldn't stop staring at, unfolding it every few minutes as she walked back through town, as if the lines might rearrange themselves into something clearer. The old survey marked the convoy's last known route in faded red ink, a dotted path that ran straight into the flats and simply stopped, swallowed by the blank white space of unmapped desert. Her father's handwriting was nowhere on it, of course. This wasn't one of his maps, but the moment she traced her finger along that dotted line, she understood exactly why he had spent years chasing it. The route made no sense. A convoy hauling that much weight, moving that many wagons, would never have cut through the flats directly. Every freighter alive knew you skirted the flats. You didn't cross them, because the sand out there could swallow a wheel to the axle and never let go. Someone had sent that convoy the wrong way on purpose, and 40 years later, nobody had ever asked why. She spent her first night out of town in a rented room above the Mercantile, counting what remained of her $92 by lamplight and doing the arithmetic of survival. How much for a mule? How much for water skins? How much for the dried meat and hardtack that would need to last her, by her father's old rule of thumb, twice as long as she thought the trip would take? What was left after all of it was barely enough to matter. But Ivy had grown up watching her father stretch a freighter's budget across 300 miles of nothing, and she knew that carrying less weight and moving smart mattered more than carrying more supplies and moving stupid. She bought an aging but sturdy mule from a rancher who seemed relieved to be rid of the animal, packed her gear with the same economy her father had taught her, tied her mother's locket beneath her collar where it wouldn't swing loose on the trail, and set out at first light the next morning, following the dotted red line on a map that led, as far as anyone in that town believed, to absolutely nothing at all. The first 2 days were unremarkable in the way the desert always is before it decides to show you what it's really made of. Long stretches of cracked earth, distant mesas shimmering in heat that never seemed to lift, the mule's hooves falling into a steady rhythm that matched her own tired footsteps. But on the morning of the third day, Ivy noticed something that made her stop walking entirely. Half buried in a dry wash, weathered down to almost nothing by 4 decades of wind and sun, was a wagon wheel. Not scattered wreckage, not the kind of debris a flash flood might carry and drop at random, but a single wheel standing nearly upright against the wash's bank, as though it had been placed there rather than abandoned. She crouched beside it for a long time, running her fingers over the iron rim, and noticed something that made the hair rise on her arms. A symbol burned into the wood at the hub. A mark she recognized because her father had once shown her the same one on an old freight manifest tucked in his files, a mark belonging to a company that had supposedly dissolved decades before the Convoy ever left the depot. She didn't sleep well that night, turning the wheel's placement over and over in her mind, and she woke before dawn to press on, driven now less by curiosity and more by something that felt uncomfortably close to obligation, as if she owed it to her father to finish what those old maps had started for him. By midday, the flats began to change character, the flat, cracked earth giving way to low, rocky outcrops that the map hadn't bothered to note, rising up out of the sand like the bones of something ancient. And it was there, tucked into the shadow of one of those outcrops, that she found the second wheel, and then, not 30 yards further, the rusted skeleton of an entire wagon frame, sunk halfway into the sand as if the desert itself had been slowly, patiently trying to swallow the evidence for 40 straight years. There was no sign of the goods it once carried, no barrels, no crates, no bones, just the frame, stripped bare, resting in a place no honest accident could have left it. Because wagons that break down on a route don't end up hidden behind rock formations a half-mile off the marked trail. Somebody had moved it there. Somebody had wanted it found by no one at all. Ivy stood at the edge of that outcrop as the afternoon light stretched long and gold across the sand, and for the first time since she'd left Ezra's store, she felt genuinely afraid, not of the desert, which she'd been raised to respect but never fear, but of the shape the story was beginning to take in her mind. 12 men, 6 wagons, a route that made no logistical sense, a company mark that shouldn't have existed. Wreckage deliberately hidden rather than scattered by accident. This wasn't a convoy that got lost. This was a convoy that had been led somewhere on purpose, and whoever had done the leading had gone to considerable trouble afterward to make sure nobody ever asked the right questions. She thought of Cassius's voice, low and careful, glancing over his shoulder before he spoke. Said somebody wanted it lost. At the time, she had taken it as an old man's flourish. The kind of embellishment that made a campfire story worth telling twice, now crouched beside a wagon frame that had been dragged and hidden with obvious intention. Those words felt less like a flourish and more like a warning her father's oldest friend had been trying, gently, to give her. She made camp that night closer to the outcrop than she'd planned, unwilling to leave the wreckage behind without understanding more of what it meant, and it was as she was clearing a flat patch of ground for her bedroll that her boot caught on something buried just beneath the surface, something with an edge too straight and deliberate to be stone. She dug at it with her hands in the fading light, sand working itself under her fingernails, until she uncovered the corner of a metal box, small enough to carry in two hands, its lid rusted nearly shut and stamped with the same company mark she'd found burned into the wheel. Her heart was hammering now, not with fear exactly, but with the particular kind of certainty that settles into a person right before their life changes shape for good. She knew, kneeling there in the near dark with sand under her nails and her mother's locket cool against her collarbone, that whatever was sealed inside that box was the reason 12 men had vanished from the face of the earth, and that once she opened it, there would be no walking away from what she found. If you've ever had a moment like that, standing right on the edge of something you couldn't take back, tell us about it in the comments below. And while you're there, do us a favor and never judge a story before it's finished, because Ivy's was only just beginning. She pried at the rusted lid with the edge of her knife, the metal groaning in protest, and as it finally gave way and swung open in the dark, what she saw inside was not gold, not jewels, not anything she could have imagined sitting alone in that store-back room for 8 long years. It was a name. A single name, written in ink that had somehow survived 4 decades sealed away from the desert air, and it was a name Ivy recognized immediately, because it was written on the sign above the very store she had just walked away from. Ivy sat frozen in the dark with the metal box open in her lap, staring at a name that made absolutely no sense in this context. And yet there it was, inked in a careful hand on a scrap of oilcloth folded inside. Coleridge and Sons. The same words that had hung on a weathered sign above Ezra's store for as long as she could remember. She had always known, in the vague way children know things without ever questioning them, that the store had belonged to her grandfather before it passed to Ezra, and to Haulin before that, back when the 2 brothers had run it together as young men. What she had never known, what nobody had ever bothered to tell her, was that Coleridge and Sons had once been more than a dusty crossroads mercantile. Tucked beneath the name on that scrap of oilcloth was a second line, smaller, half-faded, Freight Contractors, Eastern Depot, and a date that placed it squarely in the same year the convoy had vanished. Her hands were shaking now, not from the cold desert night settling in around her, but from the slow, sick understanding that her own family's name was stitched into the center of the very mystery she had walked into the flats to solve. She didn't sleep at all that night, sitting instead with her back against the rock outcrop, the box in her lap and her mind turning over every conversation she could remember having with Ezra in 8 years of living under his roof, searching for some crack, some slip of the tongue, anything that might have hinted at what he knew and had never said. There was nothing. Ezra had never once mentioned the convoy, never once mentioned that the store had done freight contracting decades before she was born, never once given her any reason to think the family history ran deeper than a modest shop selling flour and nails to ranchers. And that silence, she realized as the sky began to gray toward dawn, was itself an answer. A man who genuinely had nothing to hide didn't build a wall of silence that thick around 8 years of daily conversation. He had let her grow up in that store, sleep in that back room, work herself raw behind that counter, all without a single word about what the family name had once meant out here in the flats. Either he didn't know, which seemed impossible for a man who kept every ledger with obsessive precision, or he knew exactly what that convoy had been carrying and had decided deliberately that his niece would never hear a word of it. By mid-morning she had packed the box carefully into her saddlebag and pressed on deeper into the outcrops, no longer following the map's dotted line so much as following her own instinct, the same instinct her father had trained into her without either of them ever calling it that. The rock formations grew denser as she went, narrow passages opening between towering slabs of red stone that blocked the sun and dropped the temperature by 10 degrees in the space of a few strides. And it was in one of those narrow passages, walking the mule slowly through a corridor barely wide enough for its loaded packs, that she found the second wagon. This one was in far better condition than the first, tucked so deep into a natural alcove that no search party riding the open flats could ever have stumbled onto it by accident. its canvas cover rotted through but its frame still largely intact, and stacked beneath that rotted canvas, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow kept the desert damp at bay, were crates. Dozens of them. Not the tools and provisions a mining settlement would have needed to build a town, but something else entirely, something that made Ivy's breath catch the moment she pried the first crate open and saw, gleaming dully in the shadowed light, row after row of rifles that had never once been fired. She sat back on her heels and stared at the crate for a long time, the pieces rearranging themselves in her mind into a shape she didn't want to see but couldn't stop seeing now that it was there. A mining settlement didn't need this many rifles. A legitimate freight contract carrying tools and flour and canvas didn't need to be hidden in a stone alcove a half-mile off the marked trail, its wreckage scattered afterward to look like an accident nobody could investigate too closely. Whatever Coleridge and Sons had actually been hauling out to that settlement 40 years ago, it wasn't what the manifests would have claimed, and somebody, whether it was her grandfather or someone working through him, had needed 12 men and 6 wagons of contraband to disappear so thoroughly that not even a lifetime of searching would ever turn up the truth. Her father had spent years chasing this convoy on paper, Cassius had told her, said the maps didn't add up. Ivy understood now, kneeling in that cold stone alcove with rifle crates stacked around her, that her father hadn't been chasing a mystery out of idle curiosity at all. He had been trying to find out whether his own family had gotten 12 men killed. The thought settled over her like the desert cold, slow and complete, and she might have sat there paralyzed by it if she hadn't heard, faint but unmistakable, the sound of hoofbeats echoing somewhere back through the passage she'd just walked. She went still, every instinct her father had drilled into her rising at once, and pressed herself against the alcove wall as the sound grew closer. 2 horses by the rhythm of it, moving with the unhurried confidence of riders who knew exactly where they were going. Nobody rode into these outcrops by accident. Nobody had ridden into these outcrops in 40 years, according to every person she'd spoken to since leaving town, which meant that whoever was approaching either knew this convoy's true story as well as she now did, or had been watching her far more closely than she ever suspected on the long walk out from Ezra's store. She had just enough time to drag the loose canvas back over the open crate and pull herself into the deeper shadow of the alcove before the riders came into view at the mouth of the passage. And what stopped her heart cold wasn't the strangers themselves, but the fact that she recognized one of them immediately, even from that distance, by the particular slope of his shoulders and the way he sat a horse like a man who'd spent his whole life avoiding hard labor. It was Ezra. Riding out into the middle of a desert, everyone in town swore had swallowed a convoy without a trace, straight toward the one place on Earth where the evidence of what really happened had been hidden for 40 years, and he was not alone, and he was most certainly not there by accident. If you've ever discovered a truth about your own family that changed the way you saw everything before it, we want to hear it. Drop it in the comments. And please, whatever it is, know that this community doesn't judge, it only listens. Ivy pressed herself deeper into the shadows, her hand closing instinctively around the knife at her belt, watching the 2 riders draw their horses to a slow stop at the very entrance of the passage she had walked through not an hour before, and as Ezra swung down from his saddle and turned toward the alcove with the unhurried certainty of a man who had made this exact walk many times before, Ivy realized with a cold, sinking certainty that he hadn't come looking for her at all. He had come back to make absolutely sure that whatever was hidden in that stone alcove stayed buried for another 40 years, and now there was nowhere left for her to run. Ivy stayed pressed against the cold stone, hardly breathing, as Ezra's boots crunched over the sand toward the alcove, his companions still mounted and watching the passage behind them with the wary posture of a man standing guard rather than a man simply along for the ride. She had spent 8 years learning to read Ezra's every mood from across a store counter, the tightness in his jaw when a shipment came in short, the particular stillness in his hands when he was calculating a debt he didn't intend to forgive. And she saw that same stillness now as he crouched beside the very crate she had just covered, running his fingers along the canvas edge, as though checking that it hadn't been disturbed in years rather than minutes. He murmured something to the other man about the wagon holding steady, about nothing having shifted since his last visit, and in that single sentence, Ivy understood something that turned her stomach cold. This wasn't the first time Ezra had made this ride. He had been coming back here for years, tending this secret the way another man might tend a grave, and the whole time she had been sleeping in the room behind his store, believing him nothing more than a tired, indifferent shopkeeper. He had been slipping away to guard the truth about 12 dead men and a family name built on their silence. She might have stayed hidden until they left, might have let the two men ride back out of the passage none the wiser if her foot hadn't shifted against a loose stone at exactly the wrong moment, sending a small clatter echoing off the alcove walls that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. Both men went rigid. Ezra's hand dropped to his hip, and for one terrible second, Ivy thought she would have to decide, right there in the dark, whether the uncle who raised her was capable of drawing a weapon on his own niece. But when he stepped around the wagon frame and the lamplight from his companion's raised lantern finally fell across her face, something in his expression cracked open in a way she had never once seen in 8 years under his roof. Not anger, not the cold administrative calm he wore like armor behind the store counter, but something closer to grief. Old and deep and finally surfacing after decades of being forced back down. He didn't ask how she'd found the place. He simply sank down onto an overturned crate, the lantern light carving deep lines into his face that made him look, for the first time, genuinely old, and he began to talk in a low, unsteady voice that Ivy had never once heard him use. Their father, her grandfather, had taken a contract 40 years ago from men he shouldn't have trusted, hauling rifles under a manifest that claimed nothing but tools and flour, because the debt on the store had grown too heavy to survive another bad season, and the money offered was more than Coleridge and Sons could earn honestly in 5 years combined. Haulin, her own father, young and idealistic and utterly unaware of what the wagons actually carried, had signed on to lead the convoy because his own father asked him to, trusting the man completely, right up until the night before departure when he discovered the truth hidden beneath the flour sacks. He'd refused to go through with it. He'd threatened to report the whole scheme to the territorial marshal rather than let 12 men ride into a settlement with a wagon load of contraband weapons under his family's name. And the men who'd hired the Coleridges, men with far more to lose than a struggling mercantile, had made the decision for him instead. Ivy sat very still as Ezra spoke, the pieces of 40 years finally sliding into place, and she understood now why the convoy had been routed straight through the flats instead of around them, why the wreckage had been dragged and hidden rather than left where an honest accident would have scattered it, why the men who died out here had never been found by any search party in 4 decades of searching. It hadn't been an accident at all. The convoy's true handlers, the men who had hired the Coleridges to smuggle their rifles, had staged the disappearance themselves the moment Haulin threatened to expose them, sacrificing 12 men and 6 wagons rather than risk a trail leading back to whatever they'd been arming and why. Her grandfather, Ezra told her, voice breaking now, had spent the rest of his life paying a silent penance for a debt he never should have taken, sending money quietly to the families of men who vanished on a contract nobody could prove existed, and dying before he ever worked up the courage to tell his own sons the truth of what had happened out here. Ezra had found the ledgers years later, buried in the store's back room, and had spent every year since terrified of what would happen if the truth ever surfaced, terrified enough that he had built a wall of silence around his own niece rather than risk her ever asking the wrong question. It would have been easy, sitting in that cold stone alcove with the truth finally laid bare in front of her, for Ivy to let the anger take over completely. to demand to know why 8 years of her life had been spent under the roof of a man carrying this secret without ever once offering her comfort, without ever once explaining why he moved through their shared life like a man perpetually bracing for a debt to come due. But watching him now, an old man broken open by 40 years of guilt he'd carried entirely alone, she found something unexpected settling into its place beside the anger. Not quite forgiveness, not yet, but the first fragile understanding of a man who had spent his whole adult life terrified of becoming his father and had chosen cold distance over honesty because he genuinely believed silence was the only way to protect her from the same debt that had crushed everyone before him. He told her, there in the dark, that the rifles had never been sold, never been claimed by the men who'd ordered them made and lost, that they had simply sat buried in that alcove for 40 years as a monument to a mistake nobody had the courage to undo, and that he had ridden out here every single year since finding the ledgers, not to protect a secret, but to make sure the 12 men who died were never entirely forgotten, even if the world never knew their names. Ivy rode back out of the flats 3 days later, not with Ezra, who stayed behind to finally, formally report what he'd found to the territorial marshal, but with a letter he'd pressed into her hands before she left. An old one, written by her father in the weeks before the flood took him, addressed to a daughter he hoped might one day understand why he'd spent so many years chasing maps that didn't add up. In it, Haulin had written simply that some debts outlive the men who owe them, and that the only way to settle them is for someone brave enough to finally go looking. Ivy folded that letter into the same tin locket her mother had given her, tucking her father's words in beside her mother's pressed flower, and as she rode toward a horizon that no longer felt empty, she understood at last what that locket had always been protecting. Not a promise of what was lost, but a promise of what her family still owed the world, and what she, finally, had the courage to pay. If Ivy's story moved you tonight, if it reminded you that the truth has a way of finding the people brave enough to look for it, do us one small favor and hit that subscribe button, because there are so many more stories like hers waiting to be told, and we'd love nothing more than to have you here with us for every single one of them.